Hey guys, I've been reading a book called The Applications of No Limit Hold'em, and it's by a guy, his name's Matt Jonda. From this book, I guess the subtitle for it, it's called A Guide to Understanding Theoretical Sound Poker. And I'm about a third of the way through, a quarter of the way through or something. I've been taking it pretty gradually just because it's relatively dense compared to other uh, poker books. It's got a lot more math and formulas and whatnot. I think it really takes a kind of approach where you have to force yourself to apply it in order to integrate it. So, anyways, I got to a chapter and it's called Flop Bets in Position, and it introduces a dynamic which I familiarized myself with 2 years ago. I was in Thailand at the time, and my mentor slash coach, whatever you want to call him, he sat me down, and I remember vividly running through all of the fundamentals that are coming into play here, and there's quite a few, to the extent that it may be overwhelming at first, which is why once I reached that part of the book, I decided I'd sit down and do it again, just to internalize it on a deeper level into my unconscious competence, or whatever you want to call it. So, I guess without further ado, we'll jump in here. Um, okay, so we're faced with a problem, and that is being able to create a polarized betting range over three streets given a static sizing. Um, Off the bat, that might seem a little overwhelming, but hopefully I can demonstrate everything as concisely and as coherently as possible, and we can run through all of the components of it. Okay, so let's pretend that we're on the river. The river is the most important street in poker for obvious reasons. It's the most. It's likely to be where the pot is bloated the most, given the prior streets, and your decisions will have will be proportional. The success of your decisions will be proportional to the net result relative to the pot size. And of course, it's at its most amplified state given the bloated pot over two streets and now three. So it's very important that you have a solid foundation to fine tune your river decisions. Otherwise, you're going to lose a lot of money in poker. So, looking at this problem here, we're trying to decide. I've drawn out a little paintbrush, hopefully to help illustrate the dynamic, what's going on. Don't try to figure it out just yet, but I'll just start very gradually. So let's say we're on the river and we are the guy betting, and let's say we use a one pot size bet. So to hopefully help make things very clear here, I used the dead pot being three chips, the bet size being three chips. That would be one pot size bet. And then the defender is faced with deciding whether he wants to call or not. This call, of course, would be a pot size bet, three chips. Okay. So when we bet pot, we're giving our opponent odds of 2 to 1. And when we're giving our opponent odds of 2 to 1, that means he needs at least 33% equity to call. And that's in order to be break even. If he calls with less than 33% equity versus our range, our betting range, then we are making money at a higher rate than we should. So, in theory, against an optimal opponent, and keep in mind that at this stage of the game, of the game's evolution, hardly anyone is playing anywhere near optimal. And I think that's the recent development as people are beginning to explore the field of theory a little more, and they are, um, I guess, broadening the topic. And as is, there are still tons of limitations because it's impossible to define a lot of the parameters, especially with very limited information on our opponents. So, okay. So if we give our opponent odds of 2 to 1, we need to be giving him incentive to call our bet. If we bet with 100% of our value and we never bluff, then even suboptimal players will make the adjustment to never call us. And when I use the word value, for the sake of simplicity here, pretend that value means we have 100% equity versus his inferior bluff catching range. So if we're giving him 2 to 1 and he needs to be good at least 33% of the time to break even, that means that we should probably be bluffing at that exact frequency, 33% equity, to give him incentive to call at the right frequencies, which wins us the effective pot at the optimal frequency. So off the bat, we know that our betting range on the river is going to be comprised of 66% value and 33% bluffs. And I'll go into explaining the dead pot dynamic from there. So if the bettor is betting pot and he has 66% equity with his range, his little voice crack, but I'll continue. 66% equity with his range against the opponent's bluff catching range, then he's entitled to 66% of the dead pot off the bat, which is 2/3 of this pot of 3 chips right here. So he's entitled to that, hence the arrow. Whereas the defender is entitled to 33% of the pot because he's going to be bluff catching at the correct frequencies, which allows him to take 1/3 of the pot back, which is going to be compensation after we give him an incentive to call in the first place. Okay. And then this last chip right here, or this last third of the opponent's, or the defender's call size, very simply put, would be, okay, imagine we bet pot and he calls, so there's 9 chips in the flop, I'm sorry, in the pot. And we are entitled to 66% of that pot. And so if we take back the original 3, which was our bet, 2 from what we're entitled to 2 from the dead pot, which is here, then we win 1 more from the defender's call, which would be this. So the net gain is always 1 pot, provided we're perfectly balanced for our betting size, with 66% value that dominates his inferior bluff catching range, and 33% bluffs, which always lose to his superior bluff catching range. Okay. I guess you could look at this here, like, this is a way to figure that out. You take the absolute value of 50 minus 33, which is the bluff catching range, and then you just multiply that by 2. Here it's clearly just 33% of the call here. So now we gotta figure out how often the defender needs to call once we give him 2-1. And this is just this just takes a little algebra right here. So if we bet, if we as a better bet pot and he folds, we win 1 pot. If we as a better bet pot and he calls, we lose 1 pot, which would be our bet here. So X is the frequency the defender calls. Sorry, X is the frequency the defender needs to fold for a bet to become plus EV immediately for the better. So the optimal opponent uses that as a parameter to better define his defending frequency. So if it's plus EV to if the so the defender calls 50% to hinder the better from making a plus EV bet. And that's how he responds. If, for instance, I have a cheat sheet right here where I use all the bet sizing and the frequencies and whatnot. For example, we're doing this right now, where better bets pot. When equities are static on the river, these are the frequencies that need to be met. 66 value for 33 bluffs. The odds laid at 2-1. This needs to work 50%, which we just went over right there using this right here, this little piece of algebra. And the defender needs to defend 50% of the time with a minimum of 33% equity, which is what we talked about up here. So you can kind of take a little glance at this and see how frequencies change relative to sizing. Let's see if there's anything that sticks out. You can see that bluffing frequencies go up at a relatively shallow rate given bet sizing. So for instance, when we're betting hot pot, we only bluff 25% of the time because we expect to get called at the highest frequency possible in terms of using these bet sizes as our options here. Whereas if we were to 2x pot that, which is 4 times that size, we only need to include 15% more bluffs. Yeah, so that's cool to look at and figure out if you'd like. Okay, what's important to recognize here is when we're perfectly balanced, we always win the effective pot as a net gain. So 50% of the time our opponent is forced to call, and we're going to net 1 pot. I was going to make another little image, but I didn't. Let's pretend that the other 50% of the time we bet and our opponent folds because they have a bluff catcher which they perceive as less than 33% equity compared to our betting range. So they correctly make a fold. We'll win the dead pot 100%, which is 1 pot size bet there. So either way, we're always netting 1 pot size bet. It's very important to recognize that when we're perfectly balanced for this sizing and use these frequencies, we always net the pot. And it doesn't matter if our opponent is calling us at the optimal frequency, which is 50% here. And like I kind of demonstrated here, we're always going to win that effective pot size bet, provided everything is calibrated perfectly. which is very wishful thinking a lot of the time, because in this situation we're presuming that we're perfectly polarized. That's never going to happen in practice. We're also presuming our value is always going to have 100% domination over our opponent's inferior bluff catching ranges, and there could be situations where our opponent slow plays and deceives us, and there are lots of variables that we're not taking into account. So we're definitely oversimplifying, but we're doing that intentionally, just for the sake of building the foundations of the better defender dynamic on the river right now. So, creating a polarized betting range over presume equities. Presume value is static, and our bluffs. I reread this. I was thinking ahead a little bit. Equities is static, so presume that when called, value always wins against bluffs, and value always wins against bluff catchers, and bluffs always lose to bluff catchers. That's what I meant. Sorry. So, just to demonstrate my point here about the calling frequencies not mattering and us always yielding one pot size bet provided we're perfectly balanced. Here, this is a calculation of all the possible scenarios where he's calling at 50%. So in the past, I did this a little differently. So mathematically, it might not make sense. For instance, here, he's calling 0%, and I didn't really know how I could plug in 0% and not come out with 0. But I think intuitively it should make some sense. So I just illustrated here this dynamic. So if we're betting 2 pot size bets for every a value for every 1 pot size bet of bluff, and he's calling 50% of the time, for our value we're getting paid at 50%. So 2 pot size bets times 50% is 1 pot size bet. We lose one pot size bet when he calls one of our bluffs, which is 50%, and then we win 1 pot size bet with our when he folds the other 50% of the time. And then you could even look at it here where, let's say he's calling only 10% of the time. I'm not going to run through the whole equation again, but you can take a look at this quickly. It always amounts to 1 pot size bet. Okay. So hopefully that makes some sense. It's just very important to realize that when you're perfectly balanced for this sizing, you are always going to win the effective pot at optimal. And that can be counterintuitive sometimes, I think. Especially when everyone's way more apt to be results oriented short term. Okay, so now we've discussed this dynamic on the last street of the game. We have a good introduction. We should be strong enough in our foundations of how this dynamic plays out, but we can create a range composition over multiple streets. So using this as a hypothetical situation, and this is overly simplified once more, but let's pretend that on the flop, we always flop a range that is 20% value and 80% bluffs, like I just said. And this is oversimplified considering ranges are redistributed over each street based on complicating board texture, progressively complicating board texture every time a new card peels. You gotta run through the cycle once more of reassigning card values. So what may have been clear value on the flop may have diminished in value on a turn peel because that's threatening to your hand equity and threatens your polarity of your hand, which you were priorly betting for value. So let's presume our value is static for each street whilst our bluffs are dynamic, and that I don't know, that's close to what will happen in practice. So from the flop, if we have a range of 20%, we can bet for value on the river. We'll need to balance this by using our best 10% bluffing range from the flop. And this is simply because we're betting 2 value hands for every 1 bluff hands. For 1 pot size bet, 66% value, 33% bluff. Remember, value is static over each street, whereas bluffs are dynamic. In practice, perhaps value has 80% equity and bluffs have 20% equity, which seems pretty realistic. But each progressive street, the weaker portions of your bluffing range drops out as the better. This is a function of perfectly balance our river betting range and effectively always win the pot. As we demonstrated here, you effectively always win the pot when your range is perfectly balanced. We will discover the correct frequencies bluffs should be leaving our range, which should be at an equal rate over each street to perfectly balance our river betting range, like I just kind of said. Okay. So on the turn, we'll be betting 1 pot size bet. Also presume we're using static bet sizes. I don't know if I said that up here, but that's important too. So we're using 1 pot size bet on the flop, 1 pot size bet on the turn, 1 pot size bottom bet on the river. So on the turn, we'll be betting 1 pot size bet. So again, our opponent is receiving 2-to-1 odds. If our range on the river is 30% of our total flopping range, which as demonstrated to here is always going to win the effective pot at the highest yield possible, which is optimal, then we need to introduce more turn bluffs to balance this at the correct proportion. So a very simple way to do this, I think, is to just take, okay, we're giving him 2-to-1 on the turn. We're betting 30% on the river, which is effectively all for value, but it's kind of weird saying it like that because it consists of bluffs in that range too. So, okay, so if we're betting 30%, that's the same as saying, okay, very simple way of doing this, I think, is just saying 30% for value on the river divided by what we are laying him on the turn, which is 2-to-1. That's the same. 30 to 15 is the same as 2-to-1. So we're going to introduce 15% more bluffs. And our range from the flop, our betting range from the flop is now 45%. On the river is 30%, but we just added 15% more bluffs. So now it's a total of 45%, and that is relative to the betting range we're using from the flop. Another easy way to do this, or sorry, not that part. An easy way to figure out what our new ratio should be in terms of our betting range. On the river, it was we're betting 30% in this example, and we are assigning 2/3 value and 1/3 bluffs. Here, we know right now that we're using 45%. Now we got to figure out how much of that 45% is going to be our value and our bluffs. So an easy way to figure that out is to take 2/3, which is our frequency we're using on the river, and just put it to the power of 2. This is a cooler way of saying that, but I forget what it is. So you get 4/9. And this gives us the correct rate that, since we're moving backwards, we're introducing bluffs, but imagine we're moving forwards and we're throwing away bluffs each street to perfectly balance our range on the river. Here we find out that 4 out of 9, 4 divided by 9, that's 4/9, I should say. That's 45%, so our value is going to be 45%, and we're going to balance this with 55% of bluffs, which is 5/9. So this is what our 45% betting range from the flop is comprised of. So I was going to say something. So we introduced 15% more bluffs to balance our range. But if we were moving forward like we are in practice, we would be throwing away 15% plus. That's important to acknowledge. So our 45% betting range to flop is comprised of 45% value and 55% loss. Again, we took the same approach for the flop. A very easy way to figure out how much value and bluffs we should be betting is the same approach we just did right here, except put it to the power of 3. 8 out of 27 is what we get for our values. That's 30%, and then we should be balancing that with 70% bluffs. And then I kind of just did this part quickly. I won't go over it again. But now we've just added what is that? 22.5% more bluffs to that range. So now we have a 67.5% bluffing range from the flop, and that's what it's comprised of. So just to wrap things up, hopefully some of that was clear. When our flop, so when our range flops 20% static value and 80% bluffs, which are dynamic over each street, you throw out the weakest ones. Using a static pot size bet over 3 streets, we bet a range of 67.5% on the flop, using a ratio of 3 value for 7 bluffs. We bet a range of 45% on the turn using about 1-to-1 ratios. And then we bet a range of 30% on the river, which is this example right here, using 2 values for 1 bluff. So hopefully that all made sense. And I know I struggled trying to understand everything in the past 2 years ago when this was first introduced to me. So, as I said, I took this opportunity to hopefully solidify it for myself and then hopefully teach others who are interested. So, if you have any questions, just ask me, and then yeah, I'm open to help out. Hopefully, everything made sense. All right, thanks.